Good afternoon. My name is Chris Kerr, the Ignatian Solidarity Network, and on behalf of everyone at ISN, thanks to all those who are joining us for this special ISN Live broadcast. For over 15 years, the Ignatian Solidarity Network has been lifting up and uniting the Ignatian family. That means the Jesuit network, as well as those who are inspired to work for justice through the spiritual tradition of St. Ignatius of Loyola, to build a more just world through faith-based social justice, formation, education, and advocacy. In the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, we are here united to grow in our understanding of the situation of migrant persons throughout Central America, Mexico, at the USMexico border, and even in Canada. In total, from Panama to Canada, there are over 1 million COVID-19 cases and more than 50,000 people have perished. What is the situation of some of the most vulnerable people in the wake of this crisis? Migrants? We're grateful to be joined by partners from the Jesuit network throughout the region. With us today, we have a wonderful group. We have Yolanda González Cerdeira from Radio Progreso, the Jesuit social center and radio station in Honduras. Jesuit Father Conrado Zepeda Miramontes from Servicio, Jesuita a Migrantes in Mexico. Joanna Williams from the Kino Border Initiative on the USMexico border in Nogales, Sonora in Mexico. And Alex Vernon, a lawyer and the director of the University of Detroit Mercy Immigration Law Clinic located in Detroit on the US-Canadian border. Now, before we begin, I want to let our guests who are joining us via YouTube and Facebook and Twitter know that they're welcome to share their comments and questions by utilizing the comment section on Facebook or on the YouTube page, or by posting a tweet on Twitter that includes the hashtag ISNLive. So let's start with Yolanda González Cerdeira. Yolanda, thanks so much for being with us today. We're really grateful to have you and for joining us from Honduras. Can you help us understand the situation in Honduras and other parts of Central America as well for migrants? This probably includes those in transit, those considering leaving Central America, as well as those who've been returned to Honduras and other parts of Central America because of deportation from the United States or even Mexico. So we'll turn it over to you, Yolanda.
Hi, greetings from Honduras. It's a pleasure to be here with you and thank Chris and Joanna for the invitation. I have 5 minutes and I would like you to get an idea of what happens when a deportee arrives in Central America, let's say in Honduras. We find different situations, but let's consider a man or a woman deported from a detention center who comes by plane. Firstly, it's very difficult for a deportee to know what will really happen when he or she arrives, since there is not a protocol for their reception in this crisis, and the process has been changing every week. But let's assume he was deported last Friday. Probably he arrived at San Pedro Sula Airport in the north of Honduras. The authorities assumed he was not infected because he had already been checked by a doctor in US or Mexico. He was checked again by a local doctor, and if he did not have symptoms, he had 3 possibilities. He could go to an empty warehouse converted into a shelter in San Pedro Sula to spend the quarantine. Almost no social or humanitarian organizations had access to this shelter, but it seems that it does not have the basic conditions. Second, he could go to San Pedro Sula City, the most infected city in the country in this crisis. He was given a safe conduct that allowed him to be in the street or travel for 1 day, or he could get a taxi at the airport. If he was deported to Tegucigalpa, the capital of Honduras, it's compulsory for him to spend the quarantine in a shelter, a sports center converted into a shelter. Why the difference? I've asked these questions several times and no one can give me an answer. But let's follow the guy in San Pedro Sula, or in what we can think, or in Guatemala or in El Salvador. What does he find? He finds a curfew since March 16th. He finds that people can go out 1 day each 10 days only. He finds military checkpoints to ensure this rule, no public transportation along the country. If he has money, his chance is to take a taxi at the airport. But what if he does not have money, as is the common situation? He finds a collapsed public health system. Even before this crisis, we had a serious dengue epidemic last year, for example. He will listen to the government saying that they've got money for the emergency, and it's true, but social and medical organizations have been denouncing that politicians are stealing the money, and we have proofs for that. If you can read Spanish, you can check the Radio Progreso website, and you will find, for example, that public funds were spent in buying equipment for private hospitals, not for public hospitals. He finds that stay home slogan is not working for the majority because, as people say, if coronavirus does not kill us, hunger will do it. The humanitarian program organized by the government does only reach where it's convenient for political interest. When people go out to protest for hunger, they are repressed with tear gas bombs or with bullets. He finds, or she finds, that stay home is not working for lots of women and children because home is not a safe place. During the second half of March, there were 4,300 domestic violence reports. Last weekend, we had a case of a 16-year-old girl who was deported from the United States, even though she has an asylum case open in the United States. She fled from her father, who sexually abused her. When he arrives at his community, it can happen that people stare at him in fear and alarm, because if he is a deportee, he can be infected. There have been cases where deportees were not allowed to get into their communities. Or if he's lucky, he can find that their neighbors have organized themselves to support each other. This is quite often in rural and indigenous communities. I think it's clear that the solution for overcrowded detention centers in Mexico or United States is not deportation. And just as a final point, because I have to be like 5 minutes, I cannot be longer and know how much time I have more. Just as a final point, I would like to stress that the situation can be and is even worse for people who have been removed from the US border and southern border of Mexico with Guatemala. Probably, and Conrado will talk about this. No one will take care of them. They arrive at the Honduras frontier with Guatemala with nothing. Sometimes local governments helped them with transportation to San Pedro Sula, and that's it. There is no control, no protection, and we have no data on all of those people who had to came in different situations. And just to well the situation of several borders in Honduras with Nicaragua, with El Salvador. And we have different borders where people from Haiti, from Cuba, from Nicaragua are there. They cannot be living to Nicaragua. The
Yolanda, we're experiencing a little bit of difficulty with your internet. So, Yolanda, we'll come back to you. Thank you so much for helping us by really walking us through that very kind of personal experience, placing us in the shoes of a person being returned to Honduras or in the migration path. We really appreciate that. And we'll come back to you in a little bit with an opportunity for questions. So thank you so much for that perspective from Honduras. We'd like to turn to moving north to Father Conrado Zepeda Miramontes. Conrado, thank you for being with us. Mexico currently has a very small number of COVID-19 cases in comparison to the United States, but nonetheless, migrants in a variety of situations face significant challenges and grave dangers. Can you tell us more about what people are facing there? And I think you also have a guest with you, so I'll let you introduce your guest as well. So we'll turn it over to you.
Good afternoon from Mexico. We are located near of Mexico City for about 3 hours. And let me introduce Jennifer. She's a volunteer from California working with us. And this afternoon, we want to talk about 3 different kinds of migrants. Migrants in transit, migrants detained here in Mexico country, and migrants deported to Central America. And the first kind of migrants, we thought the flow of migrants is going to stop by the outbreak, but is not. The flow of migrants continue despite the outbreak of the coronavirus. And some shelters, they close because they have fear of contracting the virus. But some of these shelters, like us here in Hidalgo, in Huichapan, Hidalgo, we continue serving with the migrants with a lot of prevention of hygienic issues. In the Servicio Jesuita Migrantes, the Jesuit Mexican service to migrants, is they continue working from home office by phone, giving advices for psychological and legal support, and they are giving support to the people who needs food and needs rents, house rents. They are helping them to take care in this crisis.
Currently in the state of Hidalgo, specifically in Huichapan, the town in which the shelter that we are supporting, in the month of March, we received between 30 and 92 migrants a day, whereas in April, the numbers reduced significantly to only 5 to 40 migrants a day, of course, because of the outbreak and because of the borders being closed in Central America. We had 1 potential case of COVID-19, but fortunately, the migrant was attended at the local hospital and was discharged without the virus.
Okay, in relation with the virus, we don't have any cases here in the area, but I need from here, we have a lot of cases in Mexico City and Querétaro City too. We see some potential problems. Another is in a fact, because this morning we saw a strange car from, we suppose is from the
organized crime groups.
Organized crime group to try to kidnapping migrants who are crossing from the south to the north. And we saw this car some few days ago, and now we saw this car this morning. And we are warning about this situation. And we expecting the virus is going to be rapid spread between migrants and the people who are helping them, but not yet. We suppose for the environment is hot here in Mexico, and they can stop a little bit the virus. We are lack of awareness about the severity of COVID-19 and the rapid infection of rate. We have this problem with the migrants now because they don't have a lot of information, and we try to figure with them to get this information on what's happening.
The next group that we wanted to address are detained migrants. In the month of March, throughout Mexico, there are 65 migrant detention centers. In March, there were 3,759 migrants that were detained in confinement in very poor hygienic conditions.
And we know the borders of Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala countries had been closed. However, in recent days, they started receiving deported migrants from Mexico to Central America.
Among these migrant detention centers, there were protests in 5 of them. 1 person did die, and 14 migrants were detained.
Like a Human Rights Watch organization, along with other human rights organizations in Mexico, they have put pressure to the detention centers to release migrants.
And on April 18th, a federal judge in Mexico ordered that all detained migrants are to be released.
And now, yesterday, we received an official notification from the Migration Office in Mexico, announced that release all detained migrants.
3,653 migrants were released and have returned to their home countries.
And 106 migrants remain detained. But it's very controversial now because the media, they say they are not really all of them. They were returning to Central America. They just put it out of the detention center, and they are now free, but with no money, without any help from the Migration Office in Mexico. Okay.
And the final group we wanted to address are deported migrants. More than 10,000 migrants have been deported from the U.S. to Mexico, and among these, of course, are Mexicans in Central
Mexico. In one shelter in Nuevo Laredo, one migrant shelter, 15 confirmed cases of COVID-19 from people deported from Texas. Among them, the shelter director, Father Julio Lopez Vivas, is infected now, and they need to close in the border to Texas.
Many of the deported migrants are returning south by train, and of course, they include Mexicans and Central Americans.
And some migrants headed north are also returning south after family members and another contacts in the United States had warned that there are shelter in place order and no jobs. That's it.
Excellent. Thank you so much to Father Conrado and to Jennifer. Now we'll move to the U.S.-Mexico border and Joanna Williams at the Kino Border Initiative. Joanna, what can you tell us about the situation of migrants there at the U.S.-Mexico border?
I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into one piece of what Conrado was sharing about, which is the reality of folks who are arriving deported. I've had on other occasions with Ignatian Solidarity Network the opportunity to share about the different U.S. policies affecting migrants here at the border. But today I want to invite you to picture a scene with me. This is a scene that happened last week here in the state of Sonora in a small town called Sasabe. And the scene is there's an 8-month pregnant, a Honduran woman who's 8 months pregnant. She's traveling with her 2 children, and she's standing right at the U.S.-Mexico border, on the U.S. side of the border. She's starting to have contractions and is in a great deal of pain. Just a few hours ago, she'd been detained by U.S. Border Patrol when she was trying to get to safety with her 2 daughters out in the desert in Arizona. They brought her in to fingerprint her, and as soon as she expressed that she was starting to have contractions, that she was in pain, U.S. Border Patrol, instead of rushing her to the hospital, which maybe would be the logical place to bring an 8-month pregnant woman, they instead rushed her south to the U.S.-Mexico border to try to return her back to Mexico. So she's standing at this line, she's standing on the U.S. side of the line, she has 2 Border Patrol agents on one side, a Mexican official on the other side. And she's pleading with those Border Patrol agents, saying, I can't go back to Mexico, I can't go back to Honduras, I'm afraid, I need to seek asylum here. And the US Border Patrol agents respond to her, well, you should go back and then come back the legal way, which at the moment, there is no such thing. There is no legal way at the US-Mexico border in which one could seek asylum because of the fact that the border is closed, because of all of these different restrictions. And then on the Mexican side of the border, the Mexican official is standing there saying, we'll help you, just come back here, we'll help you on this side of the border, knowing full well that that isn't true. That as Conrado already spoke to, that the Mexican government, the most that they're doing is detaining people and returning them to southern Mexico, or leaving them on the streets with no support. In this case, when she finally when she was finally forced to come back to Mexico, she was given no legal status, no documentation, no support whatsoever in terms of next steps on the Mexican side of the border. And I think it's important for us to think about these policies, not just in theories and not just in statistics, but through the perspective of this moment that happened last week, as I mentioned, in the town of Sasabe. Because I think it encapsulates the moment of reckoning that we're facing as societies in the region. And that includes the United States, it also includes Mexico, it also includes Central America. Are we a society that's committed to working through this pandemic in a way that really offers a better life to our children? The teachers who are trying to put together virtual classes, the parents who are juggling homeschooling with their kids as well as work, they think that that's one of our goals in this pandemic, is to come through offering a better life for our children. The grocery store workers who are supplying our families and supporting their own children through their income also believe, I think, that one of our goals as this pandemic is to come out stronger as society and offering a better future for our children. And that's what this Honduran mom wanted as well, as she was seeking stability for her daughters in the midst of this challenging situation. But are we a society that's really committed to that? Or are we a society that rushes people south, that rushes people to deportation, that rushes them to further limbo, instead of rushing them to a hospital? And unfortunately, I think the experience of this Honduran mom illustrates that the latter is the choice that we're making as societies. That the latter is what the United States is choosing. The US is choosing to disregard all asylum laws, all protection, any kind of humanitarian inclination, and instead force people back to Mexico, even when they have no status here in Mexico. And Mexico is choosing to receive people knowing full well that they don't have the resources to support them. This mom and her kids are heavy on my heart this week, and I think on all of our hearts here, because this isn't just about policies in general. This just isn't just about border closures or deportations or the limits on asylum. These are about families that are seeking safety, stability, health, just like all of us are, and we're choosing not to respond to that. So I think the invitation to the viewers here is to remind our societies of what it is that we do want. Remind ourselves of the hospitality that we could offer, that together we can save each other.
Thanks, Joanna. And we'll come back to you in a little bit, maybe for some questions about some of the details behind that story you shared of the mother. So let's turn now to Alex Vernon. Alex is the director of the Immigration Law Clinic at University of Detroit Mercy. Welcome, Alex. Thanks for being with us. We're going to turn it over to you for a few minutes to share a perspective from the U.S.-Canadian border.
Thank you so much. And, again, as I'm listening to these updates from other regions, from the United States, from Mexico, it's very sobering for me because of my position working in the United States in U.S. immigration law, but living in Canada. I sort of get to reflect on a similar question that Joanne just reflected on. My country, Canada, has a reputation for welcoming refugees, and sometimes I wonder just how deserving we are of that reputation, given the following realities I want to share with you. So the first point I wanted to talk about is regarding the border. So in response to the COVID-19 crisis, Canada and the United States concluded an agreement to temporarily close the border to all non-essential travel. So even U.S. citizens coming into Canada cannot come unless they have some essential purpose, and the same is true in the other direction. The problem is that the Canadian government decided that people seeking protection, so refugees, are not considered essential travel, and as such, any people that present at the Canadian border from the United States to seek refugee status in Canada will be turned back. Now, I need to explain a little bit about that, in that there is an agreement between Canada and the United States called the Safe Third Country Agreement that means in most cases, people who come from the United States and go to the Canadian border to request refugee status, they will be turned back to the United States because Canada views the United States as a safe country for refugee seekers. There are exceptions to that agreement. For the most part, people who have relatives in Canada who are Canadian citizens or permanent residents or who are in the Canadian refugee process, those are the only people that are able to make it into Canada to make a refugee claim under this agreement. So in response to the COVID-19 outbreak, all refugee entrances into Canada were suspended. And the Canadian government said that people who were eligible to come in as an exception to the Safe Third Country Agreement would be allowed to come back at a later date. We were told that there were guarantees from the United States that they would not detain or otherwise prosecute people who were sent back to the United States. There is another curious phenomenon at the Canadian-US border that maybe some of you have heard about, and that is there are certain points where people are crossing or were crossing into Canada irregularly. Some would say illegally, but they were crossing in between the official points of entry. That was happening in the past because migrants and refugees realized that if they did not meet an exception to the Safe Third Country Agreement, the only way that they could get into Canada to make a refugee claim would be to cross the border outside of the regular border crossings. There was one in particular called Roxham Road between the state of New York and the province of Quebec, where a lot of people were crossing. And in fact, the Canadian National Police, the mounted police, would be waiting for them on the other side in Canada to process them, even though they had crossed illegally. So in response to the COVID-19 crisis, that irregular crossing has also been closed. It was never officially open, but people are being turned back from that irregular crossing and sent back to the United States. As far as we know, we are aware of maybe 11 people who have been sent back from the irregular crossings back to the United States. We're not aware of anybody having been detained, but we're actively trying to seek for that information. The latest update is that the border closure has been extended for 30 days, but significantly, the Canadian government has now changed course and is allowing people to come in at the regular ports of entry to make refugee claims if they meet the Safe Third Country exceptions. People who do not meet the Safe Third Country exceptions will continue to be sent back into the United States, and the irregular crossings, people are still being sent back into the United States. So that's it for the border. Regarding detention, the Canadian government has been releasing detainees at a very high rate. The numbers that I have from April 19th are that there are 147 detainees, immigration detainees remaining in Canada, down from 353 a short while before. I had a look to see what numbers were sort of pre-COVID-19, and we're looking at anywhere from 2,300 to 2,700 detainees, so significantly less than you would see in the United States. But the Canadian government has said that they will be looking to release people that do not pose a security risk. Similarly, the Canadian government has halted deportations of people with failed refugee or immigration claims, with the exception of individuals that are deemed to be a high security risk or people that voluntarily wish to be removed. So the Canadian government has suspended deportations in contrast with the United States government. Other quick issues to talk about are the fact that in response to an outcry from the agricultural sector that the legal migrant worker program was deemed an essential program, and those migrant workers, mostly from Jamaica, the Caribbean, Thailand, Mexico, will be allowed to come in to harvest the crops that otherwise would go to waste. However, there are concerns that those individuals will not be getting the proper protection in terms of protective gear, and that the employers will in effect be monitoring them and taking care of their welfare. And there's concerns from the migrant advocacy sector that the government needs to be actively involved to make sure that they're not exploited and left in unsafe conditions. The last thing is regarding healthcare. Various provincial governments, in particular, I'm aware of the Ontario government, have mixed messages, but certainly they wanted to get the word out there that COVID-19 medical treatment would be available for free, regardless of status. In some places, the word came out that all medical treatment would be available for free without status, but in practice, bills are being sent to people without the provincial health insurance. So I think that's my time for now.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was great, a great overview. Really quickly, before we turn to some questions from the group, I just want to remind those who are joining us for this broadcast that you can share a comment or question via the chat on either YouTube or Facebook, or by sending a tweet or tweeting a tweet, I guess, with the hashtag ISNLive. And we're grateful to have you join us today for this important conversation. We got to touch on this a little bit in the updates related to, from Central America and Mexico, but we had a question asking if we could talk more about people who are being returned from the United States to either Mexico or Central America, and what the situation is for them, particularly folks that maybe have been in the United States for a significant period of time and are now forced outside of the U.S. So maybe we'll go to Joanna. Do you want to speak to that a little bit, and then we can have others share as they'd like?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for the question. So I spoke a little bit about the reality of asylum seekers at the border, but here at the Kino Border Initiative, we for many years received people at the moment of deportation when folks have been living in the U.S. for several years, oftentimes on average 20 years. And they're arriving to a Mexico that in any case would be very different than the Mexico that they left 15, 20 years ago. But now a Mexico that has significant restrictions on movement and on their possibilities of where they can go from now. It's not as restricted as Honduras, which I think Yolanda already did an excellent job of describing. But here in the state of Sonora, we are under travel restrictions where you can only go out for one of 6 justified reasons, such as going to seek medical care or getting food. I was particularly struck by a man who was deported last week. He'd been in detention for several months trying to fight his legal case because he has kids in the United States. He's been living in the US more than half of his life, but he lost his case. He was deported back to Mexico. And his kids who live up in Phoenix, so only about 3.5 hours away, their thought it was, well, we'll come down and visit our dad and spend some time together. Maybe we'll travel somewhere in Mexico together in order to have this moment of restoration in the midst of what's a really difficult reality. He was, choking up with tears when he arrived, just this reality of being separated from his kids. Well, his kids can't exactly, they can come down if they all drive individually in their cars, because here in the state of Sonora, you can't have multiple people driving in a single car. And there's nowhere for them to go together as a family. He's living in a tiny room that he's renting with the support of his family from Phoenix. But it's not like they have a way in which they can spend quality time as a family before he then travels on to further south of Mexico, which is where his parents are from and where he was born. So the moment of deportation for somebody who's been living in the United States for a couple of decades is already very hard. And the COVID-19 crisis is making it even more difficult for a family to restore a little bit of dignity or connection in this time. And really is putting people in a situation where even if they have U.S. citizen family, that U.S. citizen family isn't able to come and spend time with them because of these different travel restrictions, which in some ways are understandable for public health, but for when that's intersected with such a problematic migration system and the loss of separation from children, it just becomes all the more unbearable for folks who have been deported. And then the one other factor I wanted to touch on is that already deportation causes a huge economic burden for families in the US because they're losing oftentimes their main income winner. But now it's even worse because of COVID-19, because many of the other family members who might have been working in restaurants or in other jobs also are unemployed. So there's even more economic insecurity at that moment of deportation, even less that a family in the US could do to support their family member that's been deported to Mexico. So even more in limbo and vulnerable are the individuals who arrived here.
Thanks, Joanna. And I'd like to go to another kind of way of thinking about this issue. What about people from outside of the general region we've been discussing? This could include Haitians, Cubans, even Nicaraguans. What is the situation for those folks? And maybe we'll go to, we were going to go to Yolanda. That doesn't seem like it will work right now. So let's go to Conrado. Could you speak to anything you're seeing in terms of folks from outside of kind of the Central America? I realize Nicaragua is in the Central America region, but from outside of the typical region we've been discussing so far.
Yeah, the people who, the migrants who are detained here in Mexico, most of them, they are from Central America. But we have some people from outside of the Americas. And the numbers of immigration office, Mexican immigration office, is more than 100 people. I don't think so. This is true. I don't know what they are hiring these numbers, because we know many of people from Africa and Arabic zone, they are arriving to our zone, to Mexico, cruising to the United States. But any organization is allowed to go into the migration shelters, and we are warning, or we are worrying about what's happening inside of the migration shelters from the Mexican government. It's in a fact, United States is deporting Central Americans migrants to the Mexican borders, and they are mixed with the Mexicans too, and they are going north to south by train, because we are receiving migrants from this situation in our shelter. But we are worrying about this one, because they don't have any help from even the Mexican government and the American government. And they are going to be many families and people living on the streets without water, without food, without house. And the numbers of people who are deported from the United States to Mexico is more than 10,000 people. And there's a lot of people, and more people are coming to Mexico in this COVID-19 crisis.
Thanks, Conrado. And let's go to Yolanda, who I think is back with us. I'm hoping, maybe not. Maybe we'll come back to Yolanda. There was a question, actually, it comes to a point that you brought up, Conrado. Someone asked, actually, this is a question that came from Margie. Margie is a parishioner at Holy Trinity, which is the Jesuit parish in Washington, D.C. And she said, how is the lack of water and or potable water impacting effective COVID-19 prevention and response in Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras? And this brings up a point just in general in terms of responding to the to COVID-19 in the region. You know, and the ability of folks to ensure, you know, that they're keep protecting themselves from the virus. Any thoughts on this from what you're seeing either at the U.S.-Mexico border, Joanna, or what you're seeing in Mexico? And in a second, we'll try to get Yolanda back with us as well.
Yeah, I think that probably the folks in Central Mexico and Central America can speak to this a little bit more in depth. It's, here in Nogales, we happen to be in a relatively developed part of the city of Nogales. But it speaks to what Yolanda was referencing earlier, which is that this is a crisis that's coming to health systems and infrastructure that was already inadequate and already overwhelmed. So hoping for any kind of, in the United States, we oftentimes talk about, well, what's our, how do we flatten the curve to be less than the hospital capacity? Well, in many ways that we're already beyond this hospital capacity and the capacity to even wash hands. It's something we've seen that's been particularly troubling in parts of the border, not here in Nogales, but in parts of the border where migrants are stranded in larger encampments, such as Matamoros. It's caused there have been a lot of civil society groups who have spent time just trying to get access to basic sanitation in those camps in Matamoros, because it's one thing to tell somebody to wash their hands, but if there isn't running water with which to do that, then it's really impossible to take those basic preventative measures. But I think hopefully Yolanda can speak more to that reality in Honduras.
Excellent. And on that note, let's bring Yolanda back in. And let's go to Yolanda. Yolanda, thanks for joining back with us. We were hoping you could address two things. One, the situation of folks from areas outside the region, Haiti, as well as other areas outside of the Central American region, migrants that you've seen there in Honduras. And then there was also a question about the challenges faced by communities related to potable water, safe drinking water, the ability to care for themselves and keep safe from the virus and things like that. So let's turn it over to you, Yolanda.
Well, regarding these people who are in Honduras, migrants, I think we have to make like two big, there are two groups. First is the people from Haiti and some people from.
All right, we're experiencing technical difficulties again with the internet speed coming from
Africa.
From Honduras there. I apologize for that. Let's come back to another question though, in terms of, or let's get another perspective on this question around potable water and caring for folks' health from Mexico. Conrado?
Well, we know we have many different words here into Mexico country. We have the people from the rich and the middle class. They have water, running water, and they have money to be confined into their houses. But more than 50 million Mexicans, they don't have enough money to live confined every day. And they must go outside to work, and they don't have running water. They don't have supplies to be clean against the virus. And we see in this group too the migrants. Many of they don't have any kind of support from the Mexican government or any organization. But we try the Jesuits, we try here in Mexico to make a fundraising for this kind of situation and give some kind of support of the poor into the poor here in Mexico. But we can expect. We have many problems with the poor people where they don't have money and running water.
Conrado, and we're going to try going back to Yolanda here again to address the situation of Haitians, Cubans, as well as Nicaraguans. Yolanda.
I think now. Okay, we have in last like 4 weeks two big groups of people from Haiti and some people from Cuba and Africa. The first group was like more than 100 people in the Guatemala-Honduras border. They were in the mountain. They were hidden because they were really afraid. One shelter had to open. It's a shelter run by people of the parish, and actually two girls were pregnant, and they had to go to the hospital. The hospital didn't want to accept them, and well, there were no government who wanted to take care of these people. At the end, the Escalabrinianos, the congregation, made these people go to their shelter. They ran in the Ciudad de Guatemala, so they are there. But now we have another big collective of people from Haiti, especially in the south of Honduras, in the border of Nicaragua and Honduras. They are in transit. They just wanted to go towards the north. And again, no one wants to take care. The organizations, the local organizations, the communities are trying to give like the basic things for them, but they have plenty of problems, because some people is like, there have been a lot of solidarity, but as well there have been a lot of like discrimination towards them. And another collective that is really in a really bad situation. They are people from Nicaragua. Usually they are transnational workers in Honduras or in El Salvador that now they don't have work anymore, so they want to go back to Nicaragua. We have to remind that Nicaragua doesn't have an alarm for coronavirus. They say it's not real, it's not true that the coronavirus is in Nicaragua. So in theory, their borders are not closed, but the government has denied to more than 400 people to enter into their home. So we have in several borders from El Salvador to Nicaragua, from Honduras to Nicaragua, more than 400 people from Nicaragua that they don't know what to do, since now the government from El Salvador doesn't allow them to go back to El Salvador. So they are literally in a bridge. This is a bridge between Honduras and Nicaragua. And just really quick regarding the access to water, I think it's really important and really good point. We have to take into account that according to official data, more than the 30% of population does not have access to water. Yes, it's not, they don't have access to drinkable water. They don't have access at all. So it's really difficult to have these prevention rules like stay home, wash your hands when you don't have water. There are lots of neighborhoods for example, in Tegucigalpa, in the capital of Honduras, they only have access, for example, 2 hours per week. You have to buy water, just not only to drink, but also to wash your hands. And so for sure, this is these structural conditions that make with the impact and of this type of epidemics or pandemics are much worse here than in other places.
And Yolanda, that actually brings me to another question I'd like to ask you, and since we have good internet, and then work our way to others too. What is the, recognizing that the pandemic not only has a human toll, but we also recognize there is an economic toll that it will play on nations and communities worldwide. what do you see being the impact, thinking back to the last global recession that happened a number of years ago? What do you see as the impact of a economy, both here in the United States as well as in Central America, taking a downturn, and how that might impact the situation of migration in the coming months and even years?
Well, I think we are already seeing the impact. Lots of families are already suffering the impact. We have to take into account again, Honduras has more than 60% of the people who should be working, they are unemployed, or they are employed in the informal sector. That means 60% of the people do not have an income now, because if they work, they go out to work, they can be detained because they break the rule, and so it's really difficult. And we already have a lot of families who depend on the maquilas, these big factories, and the labor secretary has, gave like permission for these big maquilas to suspend, not to pay the workers for 4 months, and they don't have to give any justification for that. So nowadays there are lots of people without an income, and this is really, people are hungry. They don't have to eat, and we have to take into consideration as well, and we have to look at the impact of the probable like lower remittance. Honduras, the 20% of the interior, gross interior product, 20% of the economy is based on the remittance. And the World Bank said like 2 days ago that the provision is that the remittance will decrease more or less 20%. So this will have a real impact in so many families that depends on this remittance from people in the United States.
Thank you, Yolanda. And Conrado, from a perspective from Mexico, what do you see as the impact of the economic downturn that we'll see from this pandemic crisis on communities in Mexico?
Well, we have a recession now, economic recession, and it's going to be impact with the poor people, with migrants and refugees, and we think about it. All these different countries to focus to give help to migrants and refugees, because they lost the small works and they don't have any kind of support, and they are going to be very hungry. I have some notice about refugees from the border of El Paso in Ciudad Juárez. They don't have any penny to buy food, and they are suffering about this crisis. And we need to think about it together in collective to how we can do for them. And in Mexico and Central America, also in the United States and Canada, refugees and migrants, they are going to be hungry, and most of them.
And Joanna, a perspective from the U.S.-Mexico border on the ways that this could impact border communities, impact those who you see at the Comodoro and Nogales.
Yes, I think one piece I've already touched on, which is that many of the people who are arriving in Nogales, Mexico, whether that's asylum seekers or folks who are being deported, are reliant on their families in the U.S. to send them money, which that source, just like the remittances to Honduras, that source of support has also dried up. The other dimension here is that we with the border closure, or the partial border closure, because US citizens can still cross, but in general, sales in the economy on both sides of the border have been hurt because Nogales as a community relies on people crossing the border to go out to restaurants, to go to the dentist, any number of activities. So people are losing their jobs here in Nogales, Mexico, as well as in Nogales, Arizona. And one very specific piece, this is a little less related to migrants, but it is because of all of the labor that goes into it. But here in Nogales, we're one of the primary ports of importation for fruits and vegetables. And now that the restaurant industry isn't demanding as much fresh produce, the produce companies here are losing money, and they don't even have a place to send all of their fruits and vegetables that they're importing at this time. So these will have longer term ripple effects for the capacity of the community to offer work opportunities, to offer hospitality to people who are arriving. And I think we've only started to see the very tip of that iceberg. We've only started to see the remittances piece. We haven't quite seen yet the fallout of these other harms related to businesses in Nogales, Mexico, and the transnational trade and how that's impacting folks.
Thanks, Joanna. And Alex, as an immigration lawyer who often works with people when they're in their most kind of vulnerable situations, can you offer any reflections on the ways that you see people being more at risk in their immigration situations in the coming months?
Certainly. It's very concerning that there are various state governments and various branches of the federal government that seem to be responding to this crisis with appropriate measures. The immigration system in the United States, for the most part, let's say the deportation system is continuing as usual. Immigration courts have suspended hearings for non-detained cases. However, detained cases have been going forward. Despite immigration judges and even the attorneys from the Department of Homeland Security coming together and writing the Department of Justice and saying, please, close the immigration courts. The priority seems to be, let's get these people deported. We've been told that Immigration and Customs Enforcement is doing detention reviews for detained migrants, but that we're not to expect mass releases, even for people that don't have any security risks or criminal history. So it's very frustrating that people who are detained continue through their immigration proceedings and, are denied at high rates and end up deported, despite the fact that you would think the humanitarian response or the public health response to such a crisis would be to release people who are not a public health risk or a public safety risk, because if they are detained and are at risk, a greater risk of getting the disease, they may pass it. So even if you don't care about migrants, you need to care about the general society and the fact that confined people are more likely to catch the virus and pass it on to other people, including their jailers, including the corrections officers that may take it into the community. The other frustrating thing that we have seen is continued denials of cases for frustrating reasons. I had a case of a victim of human trafficking who applied for permanent residency that was denied because the government says the application was received a day late. Fortunately, we have proof that it was in fact received on time, and we have to file an appeal. But in the meantime, this person that should have had his green card and all of his derivatives would have had their green card is waiting for an appeal to go through the system, has no work permit, is in quite a vulnerable situation. He is in a state that has a law that says there should be no evictions during the COVID-19 crisis, but he and the other people in his building have been served eviction notices, and it's hard for them to know how to make sure that law is enforced and that they're not evicted. So these are the kind of concerns regarding vulnerability that are on my mind. I don't know if you have any other questions on areas that I haven't touched on.
Thanks, Alex. That was great. And we had one question from someone earlier that was shared on social media. If you could just offer a really quick response. And they asked, what happens to someone who is deported from Canada, let's say someone from Central America or Mexico? Are they returned to the United States, or are they returned to their home country, their original home country?
So if they have gone through the refugee system in Canada, usually they would be sent back to their home country. The only time they would be sent back to the United States is if they came from the United States and are sent back at the border pursuant to safe third country. But as for deportations, now, as I said before, the Canadian government has put in place a temporary moratorium on deportations, except for people that are serious security risks on a case-by-case basis. So individuals from Central America who have removal orders in Canada would not be being removed at this time.
Great, thanks, Alex. That was helpful. We had many questions, unfortunately, from social media we weren't able to get to, but we covered a lot of ground here today, and I would imagine that we could do this for many hours and not talk about everything. We did have a question from a parishioner at a parish in Washington, D.C., and she said, how can a Catholic parish in Washington, D.C. or work with Congress, to fight for the immigrants, fight for migrants, something beyond charity? So thanks for that question, Alan. We actually wanted to invite people to take action right now. If you text COVID to 202-800-1541 to send a message to your members of Congress to support vulnerable communities, including those who are seeking asylum at the U.S.-Mexico border, those vulnerable communities within our own borders here in the United States, as well as supporting continued foreign aid that assists communities in other parts of the world. You can text this number again, or text COVID, COVID, to 202-800-1541. We'll make sure to put that in the chat as well on Facebook and YouTube here. Before we go, I just want to say thank you to our guests today. Again, thank you to Yolanda, Father Conrado, Joanna, and Alex for joining us from across the hemisphere to offer these invaluable perspectives on the situation of migrants throughout the region. Really grateful for your partnership and continued companionship. So thank you so much for being with us. For those joining us today, if you liked what you experienced with this ISN Live broadcast, we have a few other things coming up. This Thursday, we'll be featuring a Jesuit ministry that is doing good work. It's called Good Works, is the name of the program. It's a 30-minute program where we share what's happening across the country in terms of responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. We'll be featuring the Guadalupe Homeless Project at Proyecto Pastoral, which is in Los Angeles, California. So excited to share their story. And then later over the next few weeks, we'll have our Solidarity on Tap series continuing. This Wednesday, we'll feature Sister Simone Campbell, who is the Executive Director of Network, Catholic Social Justice Lobby. And next week, on Wednesday evening, we'll feature Sister Helen Prejean, who's the Executive Director of the Ministry Against the Death Penalty and a well-known advocate and author. So we're excited to welcome them. Thank you again for being part of this broadcast of ISN Live. Thank you so much for being with us, and have